Okay, and here is the fair in all of its glory. So you can see that it was oriented here on the water, so that it could be accessed by by ship. So they had lots of ships that would come in and drop people off here, but it could also be accessed by rail. So they built terminals into which people could arrive this way, and that way, lots and lots of people could disembark. And so it's just this really, really fascinating structure. And let's see here. So this, I'll get that right. So this area right here, this is the most famous, probably, view of the whole place. Was this sort of long walkway, and it was the area that a lot of people would walk into, so it was well remembered. But you had this little waterway here, and then this waterway here. Think of it like the reflecting pool on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., something similar to that in effect. Just really beautiful, lined with white buildings on both sides. This massive structure here, which was one of their main halls that had, the larger events in it. And then you come along this way, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this was the horticulture building over here, because with this glass roof, and then you had this sort of lagoon area back here. Back there's Ferris wheel, which we'll talk about shortly, and then you had innumerable other little pavilions on off this way. But it's really impressive that they could develop such a structure. So the cost of the event was $28 million in total, and the building and grounds, so just the physical, what you see right here, was something along the lines of 18 million. So it's really significant money for the time. In total, this fair will see 21.5 million paid visitors going to it, and will actually come away with a profit of some $450,000. So these things are kind of like an Olympics. A lot of countries don't really expect to make money off the Olympics. They're more for notoriety and showing off the country, tourism, then, but also in the future. All those sorts of things are more valuable than the actual event being profitable, but sometimes world fairs can be profitable. The 1851 event in London was profitable enough that they were able to start the Victoria and Albert Museum afterward using the proceeds. And here it's nearly $500,000 in profit as well. So doing pretty well. So the leaders of this event: Burnham, Atwood, and Olmsted. So Daniel H. Burnham is an architect, and he's the leader of this event. His Chicago firm was responsible for some 300 buildings that were built in Chicago over about 18 years. So what they're well known at the time as prolific builders for the area, and so it would only make sense for them to use a Chicago architecture firm just to show off what Chicago can do. They were notable for developing some of the first skyscrapers in the nation, so that was a big deal for them. And they also focused on efficiency as sort of a calling card in their agency, and so that was a selling point as well for them, being available and capable of handling this large of an event. So they're known for technical skill, leadership skills, and so they tapped him to lead the exposition. And his partner in all of this is going to be Charles B. Atwood, Atwood. He's a designer, so more on the artistic side of figuring out how things are going to look. He trained in Massachusetts, and they saw some of his early work and pulled him into the exposition as well. And the most famous of the three, who is famous well beyond this event in Chicago, he just happens to be involved, is Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, you may or may not have heard his name before, but you've definitely seen his work. The most famous being Central Park in New York City. He's considered one of the geniuses of all time in designing landscapes, especially public spaces. That is his forte, and so he did Central Park and then many others throughout the U.S. I believe he was the Forest Park in St. Louis is one of his. And so just incredibly famous in the public space designing world in his lifetime, not just like he did it and then became famous later like some artists do, but he was well known. He was contracted to design the grounds of Biltmore. We've talked about Biltmore previously in the class. I had some videos that you could see the estate with the Vanderbilt family, and he was tapped to come in and design those grounds as well. And so, for him to come in and do this, it's well within his wheelhouse of work. And then what's interesting is once the event was over, then he redesigns the grounds. Like, how can we make use of the work that we've already done? And so in Chicago today, you can go to Jackson Park, and it's a portion of the grounds that were created for the exposition are still there today, even though you don't, just walking around, if you don't know that it was there, you wouldn't really just recognize it. But he took what was there and then kind of reworked it so that it would work as a regular public park as well. So kind of a neat thing for him to be involved, and an interesting trio. And there's a good bit more information out there that you can dig into with them, but I want to get in here and look at the beginnings of the event itself. All right, opening day. The little picture here is the title, "The Ceremonies in Front of the Administration Building." No, you can read it here. But it was not only the supreme moment in the history of the land and the West, but the moment of moments in the lives of a vast majority of the beholders. It was the most beautiful spectacle which man has ever created to please his own sensibilities or satisfy his vanity. So, pretty, what they call it, purple prose there, very flowery prose to describe the moment. But you can imagine people kind of getting carried away, these kind of events, given the fact that, most people tended to live relatively simple lives before the turn of the century. The number of new things that they would see in a given week, month, or year would have been relatively few, even though the Industrial Revolution is happening. You're hearing about things, but to suddenly have all of it drop into a single place in Chicago, and all these people can just come and see it all in one time, you can imagine that would be quite overwhelming. So I'm sure a number of people felt that it was one of those grand events of their life. So this particular day is going to start out a wet, rainy day in Chicago. Kind of puts a damper on the festivities, but they are holding out hope that it would get better, and it did. It cleared up enough for them by, I think it was about midday, that they, or even mid-morning, I believe, that they started to, send out the thousands of workers to put up all the bunting and the banners, things that would get ruined by wet weather. All the people got really, really busy to get ready for all of the crowds that were coming. And President Grover Cleveland is there, as I mentioned. He's there to help start the celebration. And the procession for this first day is going to begin at the president's hotel, and it's going to be quite the thing. It's a bit of a parade through the town. Cleveland's in his carriage, and he has an entourage with him, and so it's very exciting. Lots of dignitaries for this opening ceremony. All of the terminal stations for people to get down to the actual fairgrounds were overloaded. People were cramming into the rail cars, trying to get there. People always want to be there day one if they can. Just like going to opening night for an exciting movie, you kind of want to be there for day one of the fairgrounds, because that's when the most energy and all the excitement is going to be, bubbling over. Private carriages were headed there as well, but the roads were clogged. Even 9 steamships are enlisted to be ferrying people from downtown area down to the park, the pier there at the park. So by 11 a.m., about 100,000 people arrive to visit this event on its very first day. So great fanfare. The president gives an address, others give an address. It was common at the time for addresses to run rather lengthy, but here you get a sense of some of the crowds that are kind of spread around the. I believe that's the lagoon area. Let me jump backwards here and look at that picture, see if we can see. I want to say that it's what we're looking at right there is this view from, like, the people would have been spread this way and this way around this structure, but I'd have to double check that. That looks right to me. But you do get a sense of how white everything was, because they called it the White City. Literally everything was just white, and it was a really striking thing. So after the president and the other dignitaries give their speeches for the day, they go off to a banquet, because it's midday at that point, and then they go on a sort of whirlwind tour by carriage. So rather than people wandering the park on foot, they gave the president and his fellow dignitaries the quick version that they could get around rather quickly and hop out and see things and hop back on. And so that's the way they worked that out for the president. Here's the president. This is the Director General Davis introducing President Cleveland to the foreign commissioners in the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building. So one of the many buildings there they were going to get to go and visit, but honestly, there's no way that they could take it all in. It's impossible. You would have to, this sort of thing, you would need multiple days to feel like you got a pretty good portion of it. It's like going to visit the Louvre Museum in Paris. You to really see it, you would need at least a couple of days, if not 3 or 4, if you want to stop and admire or take your time with anything. It's quite a collection, and so this was the same way. You would need plenty of time to explore it all. And so the crowds will continue exploring all of this. I was just going to point out some of the things you're seeing here. So you see all the people in their dignitary garb, some of the Asian visitors here as well. So it's just a whole hodgepodge of people. It's very exciting. And so the people are going to continue seeing the exhibits all the way until sunset, and that is when the illumination got turned on. So here's the Great Hall that they had, that very large structure at the bottom, or the bottom part of the first picture that you saw. So tons and tons of people could crowd into here and hear bands play, and so that they had like a regular rotation of bands that people could mill in and out, and as they made their way around the facilities. And here's some more of opening day. There's that large building in the background there. It's even more impressive to see it in photograph form, just because all this structure is just incredibly sized. You think of this thing and more on the scale of like a large Major League Baseball park or something like that. It just is shocking in its scale sometimes. And the lagoon, you could also take boats out in these various parts of the park, so that was a lot of fun. Here's a long view of that particular lagoon back there where they had the speeches, and all along the way here. And all this was mirrored in that central lagoon. So let me pause right there, and we'll be back in a second to talk a bit more about the attractions.